Hey, American Lit. Today we are continuing our discussion of author's purpose by discussing satire. And satire fits into the collection of purposes that we already have to describe, inform, narrate, entertain, analyze, persuade, do several of these at once. So we've spoken mainly about to inform, entertain, or persuade. And satire really, as we read the definition below, tends to fit into the entertain and persuade category, as we'll see. Satire is a literary form that ridicules the shortcomings of people and institutions in a way to bring about change. So, two important pieces of this. There is ridicule. It is cutting against something, right? It's pointing out the flaws in something, but it's not just to be mean, okay? It has the positive intent to bring about some kind of positive change. And we will see that with Mark Twain's piece, The Lowest Animal, which we'll read next. So there are a number of elements of satire that you can detect in the language which indicate whether or not an author is being satirical. One way is to be humorous, right? If you're making fun of something, usually that means that you're being, often that means that there's some kind of criticism being made. You can exaggerate something, make it absurd. So these, to overstate or to describe an extreme situation, usually if something isn't apparent because it's muted or it's not as obvious, we don't get the point as easily as a reader. So exaggerating and making something absurd can make those points, those criticisms stand out to us more, and make flaws stand out too, right? When you exaggerate a flaw, it becomes more obvious. And so this definitely serves the purpose of making that pointed criticism. Lastly, a technique we might see is irony or verbal irony, where you're stating the opposite of what is really meant. And you might think of this more easily as sarcastic. When you're being sarcastic, that is exactly what you're doing. You are stating the opposite of what you really mean. Oh my gosh, that homework was a lot of fun. Like it wasn't a lot of fun, and we can tell that from the context, and it makes the point, right? Very clear. So we're going to jump back to 373. This is where The Lowest Animal starts. First, you get a little bit of background on the author, Mark Twain, whom is best known probably for The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He is a regionalist writer, so uses the dialects and situations of the the characters of the time, usually how they would really speak. He is writing this essay, which was published way later than it was actually written, right? So it was written very at the end of the 19th century and then published much later than that. But when it was written, right, it was only a few years after the publication of The Origin of the Species, which was sort of the rave in the scientific community at the time, this idea that particularly that man had evolved to become sort of the dominant species. And so he's going to be exploring this as he gets into his essay. So let's take a look. The lowest animal. Man is the reasoning animal, such is the claim. And I noticed right away, right? Man is the reasoning animal. Okay, I'm going with that. That's pretty accepted. Such is the claim. That second sentence makes me wonder, okay, are you then calling that into question? And indeed, as we read this next paragraph, it seems like that's the case, right? I have been studying the traits and dispositions of the lower animals, so-called, and here putting lower animals in quotes, putting parentheses around it, makes me think like, oh, if he's putting it in quotes, he means like that's usually a signal that someone's being ironic, right? That they want us to think that this is something other than what it's actually stated as, right? So are they really lower animals? And this is the question that Twain wants you to think about. And contrasting them with the traits and dispositions of man. I find the result humiliating to me, for it obliges me to renounce my allegiance to the Darwinian theory of the ascent of man from the lower animals, since it now seems plain to me that that theory ought to be vacated or abandoned, in favor of a new and truer one. This new and truer one to be named the descent of man from the higher animals. Okay, and so here right away we definitely get his claim, right, which is that he's going to take Darwin's theory of evolution, right, that man has ascended through evolution to be sort of the dominant species. He's going to turn that on its head and say that it's going to be the descent of man from the higher animals. And this is an absurdity. This is something, well, even at the time, Darwin had painstaking observations that supported what he was claiming in the theory of evolution. And to sort of turn this on its head is an absurd claim in and of itself. So it makes us really think, oh, how can you do that? How can Twain take that and turn it on its head? And while it sounds absurd, it also makes us interesting at what exactly he's critiquing, to put man, right, take them from this high pedestal and move them down to the lowest of animals. And so you can already tell what the target of his criticism is going to be man. And we'll read on how that is. So he goes on, and I'm going to briefly summarize this part here. He basically sets up his experiment as a series of observations in the London Zoological Gardens. He sets up, right, he enumerates the generalizations that he was able to make. The form and the style of how he's setting up his experiment here is almost a mock scientific paper, right? And it is sort of funny because he's sounding so serious, right? Using words like quadruped, and certain generalizations, to wit. This is very formal language meant more often in a scientific paper, but we of course know that this is all in the context of this absurd claim that he's going to turn the theory of evolution on its head. And it just makes us more aware of, okay, well, this is definitely entertaining. Let's see how he's actually going to make his case. It makes us interested. We want to read on to see how he's going to do that. So here's how we get to where we get to his first of a series of comparisons, which starts around line 33 down here. Some of my experiments were quite curious. In the course of my reading, I'd come across a case where many years ago, some hunters on our Great Plains organized a buffalo hunt for the entertainment of an English earl. So an earl is just a title of nobility. Barons, dukes also are titles of nobilities. But basically, it's someone who's set up pretty high in society in England. That, and to provide some fresh meat for his larder, so a place where he keeps food. They had charming sport. They killed 72 of these great animals and ate part of one of them and left the 71 to rot. All right, so this is the English earl. In order to determine the difference between an anaconda, which is a big snake, and an earl, if any, I caused 7 young calves to be turned into the anaconda's cage. The grateful reptile immediately crushed one of them and swallowed it, then lay back satisfied. It showed no further interest in the calves and no disposition to harm them. I tried this experiment with other anacondas, always with the same result. The fact stood proven that the difference between an earl and an anaconda is the earl is cruel and the anaconda isn't. Okay, and so this is his conclusion, and obviously it puts the anaconda above the earl, which is, even when we imagine that, right? An anaconda is low to the ground physically, literally, like we can imagine that, whereas the earl stands up on 2 feet, is higher, and that just makes the contrast even more stark to us, that even though the earl stands taller and is apparently taller, the anaconda actually has better morals in this case. This seemed to suggest that the anaconda was not descended from the earl. It also seemed to suggest that the earl was descended from the anaconda and had lost a good deal in the transition. All right. And so this is, clearly pointing up some kind of moral shortcomings. You might call this gluttony, right? Where, the hunters, right? The earl is just going out and killing so many of these animals and being very wasteful, right? Just taking one of them and leaving the other 70 some to rot. whereas the anaconda just takes the one that he needs, leaves the rest alone, right? And exhibits some moderation in that process. And so here, this is all kind of humorous, right? This sort of comparison that we, are going to compare these two in a sort of scientific, scenario here. And the result of that is that the anaconda, right, a snake with no title, nothing, that we can determine in terms of like the ability to reason or anything like that, is still higher than the Earl. And that, to us, that result, one of many in the comparisons that he's going to make, is humorous. It's absurd. It's exaggerated the claim that he makes here, right? That the Earl is descended from the anaconda. It's crazy, but the fact of the matter is that this satire points up a key shortcoming in man, which is that we are very wasteful. And this is just one of the shortcomings that he'll point up in this text. So as you read on, hopefully we'll see more of that. Hopefully you'll be as entertained as I was when I went through and saw these comparisons.